So we are going to go ahead and get started, and I know many of you, for those of you that don't know me, I am Dr. Archer, and I run this little lecture series, the History Lecture Series. It is my genuine pleasure to bring in faculty from around the campus and sometimes from off campus to talk about various areas of expertise. And today we have Dr. William A. Taylor, who is one of the mainstays in our security studies and criminal justice department. He is a series editor, which means he helps to oversee book series, but not just for one book series, for two book series, a studies in civil military relations, and then also a studies in Marine Corps history, which is pretty cool. He is also the author or editor of 7 books. Yes, 7 books, including most recently Peace, War, and Partnership, Congress and the Military Since World War II, and that's out of Texas A&M University Press. They have a really good military history program there. His work has won all sorts of awards, honors, and prizes, including the Association for Documentary Editing, Sharon Reitnor Stevens Prize. That was in 2021. Selected as required reading for every first-year cadet at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 2020, and the Crater Family Book Prize, honorable mention, in 2015. So basically, you're getting an expert in the field today, free to you. You will have an opportunity to ask questions at the end of his lecture. There are no stupid questions, only unasked ones. So please feel free to ask your questions. Do note that there are microphones all along the room, so try to keep talking to a minimum to nil. Make sure your phones are on silent or vibrate, right? And if you need to leave or pop out and come back in, we understand. Try to use that middle door and just be discreet, quiet when you come back in. Otherwise, enjoy the lemonade, the water, the food, and more importantly, the edification as we welcome Dr. Taylor.
Well, thank you, Dr. Archer, for the kind introduction, and thank you to you all, the audience, for being here today, especially as the temperature is plummeting all around us. So thank you so much. It's my honor to be here with you today. As Dr. Archer said, my name is Bill Taylor. I've been asked to speak for about 45 minutes on the campaign for universal military training after World War II, and then we'll open it up for discussion and any questions that you might have. We'll have about 45 minutes to do that as well. All right, so just real quickly, my background. So I'm chair of the Department of Security Studies and Criminal Justice here at ASU. I've been here as a faculty member through all the various ranks since 2011. I came here straight out of graduate school and have loved every minute of it, and I really call ASU home. My educational background, so I did my undergraduate degree at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. I did master's degrees at University of Maryland, Georgetown University, and George Washington University, and then my PhD at George Washington University as well. I have degrees in both history, specifically military and diplomatic history, and also security studies. So I have a dual background in that sense. My military service, upon graduation from the Naval Academy, I did serve in the Marine Corps, so I often joke with friends, I went to Navy, I served in the Marine Corps, I'm primarily an Army scholar, and now most of my students are in the Air Force. I've covered all my bases, but I certainly have enjoyed my military service as well. I just want to give some brief acknowledgments. It's just a real honor to be here with my colleagues from the Dr. Arnardo de Leon Department of History, and so it's a real honor for me. And this lecture series is supported by the Dorsey B. Hardiman Endowed Chair in History, and then I just want to give kudos to Dr. Kenna Archer for all the hard work that she put in, not only to this talk today, but to the series as a whole. It's important work that they all do over there as well. All right, so when I go through this presentation, I'm going to have a series of quotes that I'm going to present to you, and I do that for 2 reasons. One is this research is heavily derived from primary source research, research in almost all the presidential archives, all the military archives around the country, and most of the work you'll see here is from that. So I've tried to present that just from a methodological standpoint, the importance of primary sources to research. but also, perhaps more importantly, is it's important to understand, to hear from the historical actors themselves. So I will contextualize what I present, I will provide my own analysis of what I present, but it's important to hear in their own words what people are talking about, in this case, in the 1940s and early 1950s, okay? So let's go ahead and begin. This is George C. Marshall, and if you don't know George C. Marshall, you get to know him a little bit in this presentation, but he was one of our senior military leaders in the 20th century, probably one of the biggest personalities in the 20th century, often attributed as the architect of U.S. victory in World War II, and would go on to senior posts after World War II as well. And he's talking here about the obligation to serve, specifically universal military training. Quote, our failure to provide for universal military training in 1920 and the tragic repetition of that error following World War II are largely responsible for the call we must make on our young men today. I am convinced that it would not now be necessary to interrupt the normal course of their lives if we had taken the conservative, wise action, an effort that was defeated largely by emotional rather than logical reactions, end quote. And that's George C. Marshall speaking in 1951. As we go through the presentation, you can find this work published in a variety of ways and a number of sources. The first is, if you're interested in George C. Marshall's views on universal military training, which we'll talk about throughout today, they can be found in this book that I edited. I had the great privilege of leading a team of distinguished scholars who all contributed a chapter on their expertise. So I wrote a chapter on universal military training. I edited and brought the whole book together, but we had a whole range of other issues you can see here on the screen where George Marshall played an important role in the Cold War. But the chapter on universal military training in this book is relevant. Military service and American democracy. This book covers military service as an idea and how it's changed over time. So it asks two fundamental questions: who serves and how they do so. And that has obviously changed over time. This book covers World War II to the present. Each chapter is a decade, so there's a chapter in there that covers the 1940s, and one thing it talks about is this campaign for universal military training in a chapter form. And then for the whole story, this is my first book, Every Citizen a Soldier, the campaign for universal military training. And this entire book tells a story that I'm going to give you an overview of today. And so it's a campaign that kind of ran from 1943 to 1948, and I'll talk about the details here momentarily. But those are some sources in terms of published sources that talk about this material that we're going to cover today. The trainee comes home. This is the War Department, so if you're not familiar with it, prior to 1947, what we know of today as the Department of Defense was actually the War Department and the Navy Department prior to what we call a unification in the National Security Act of 1947. So this was primarily the Army and Air Force. The Air Force was not an independent branch at that point, and it was covered in the War Department at that time. So 1945, this is a brochure that the War Department really outlined their views on what this campaign, what universal military training would look like. The trainee comes home. Quote, the trainee has given up a year to his country. In return, he has acquired confidence that as long as he and other boys like him are prepared for the eventuality of combat, they can look forward to a prosperous future untroubled by war, end quote. And that's the War Department in a UMT, Universal Military Training brochure, 1945. All right, so before we dive into particulars, I like to talk about big themes, big ideas that are going to be threads throughout this talk. And these are some of them. I'll just touch on them very briefly. One is the dichotomy between national security and individual liberty. In American democracy, these two ideas are both important. Where it becomes contentious is the correct balance between the two. So most reasonable observers think they're important. It's just a question of how do you balance those two. That certainly infuses the debate about UMT. Second, significant military power of World War II after, or significant power of the U.S. after World War II. It's hard perhaps for many of us to imagine a time when the U.S. was not a global superpower. But we don't have to look back that far. Prior to World War II, the U.S. military was rather anemic. It was very small, did not have a ton of capability. And that growth really comes out of World War II. If you can imagine, many of our allies lie in ruins. Their homelands are destroyed. We were fortunate to not suffer that same fate, although we did lose casualties. The casualties we lost paled in comparison to many of our allies and certainly adversaries as well. So that context about military power really comes out of World War II. Strategic fixation. So I argue in the book about this topic that military leaders became fixated on this idea of universal military training. You'll see why as this talk plays out. But they did so in a way that hurt their own ultimate goals. So they had a plan that they thought would be able to get support for. In many ways, they did get a lot of support for it, but it failed to come to fruition. And in many ways, that left them unprepared for the future. Civil-military relations, I just want to touch on that briefly. That's the idea that the relationship between the government on the one hand, the military on the other, and society on the third really is a relationship that ebbs and flows over time. It deals with a lot of different topics. This is certainly one in which civil-military relations is a key theme. The Cold War draft, if you're not familiar with it, so the defeat of UMT, which I'm going to be talking about in 1948, is also the birth of the Cold War draft, which comes into effect in 1948 and would stay in effect till 1973, and then would transition to what we call the all-volunteer force in 1973 through the present. So that's an important theme. This idea of support versus success. So one thing that got me interested in this topic to begin with is, as I started researching, I found there was a great deal of support for this idea. Obviously, this idea did not come to fruition. It's a road not taken. But what was interesting is, given the large amount of support for this idea, why did it not become successful? And I'll talk about that as we go through this talk. And then finally, the main argument I make, which I'll touch on as we end, is this paradox of preparedness, this idea that short-term and long-term planning in a military sense are often in conflict, and that during peacetime there's often not a sense of urgency to achieve the long-term solution, but when crisis arises, it privileges a short-term solution. And we'll see this between selective service and UMT. In many cases, most of the planners at the time wanted UMT. They thought that was the sound long-term vision, but every time there's a crisis, you couldn't get that implemented quickly, and so you had to go with something you could get implemented quickly, which was selective service. Once you implement that, you could get soldiers in a very quick order of time. So it privileges then sometimes not the best solution because it can be implemented quickly, is the argument. Okay, a grave decision. This is the Washington Post in 1945. Quote, "This nation faces a grave decision, whether or not to continue in peacetime the drafting of its young men for military training. The proposal concerns not only every boy and parent, but every citizen of this country. It involves our national post-war security and the world's post-war peace," end quote. And that's the Washington Post, 1945. And what they're talking about with this grave decision is, what is the future of the national security landscape going to look like coming out of World War II? And one of the ideas was that every 18-year-old male, and it was males at the time, I haven't seen any research that would indicate otherwise, but every 18-year-old male would go to military training. They would go through 1 year of military training. It would be obligatory, universal, everybody would have to do it, and then they could go back to their lives. If they wanted to join the military, they could, but they didn't have to. And they called this Universal Military Training, or UMT. The main campaign for it was 1943 through 1948. It was an extensive campaign and became a major debate in American society. And just to illustrate that, it was the national high school debate topic in 1946. So if you were on the high school debate team anywhere in the country, you would debate either for UMT or against it, and that's how they would judge debate teams at the time. And you'll see as I go through these sources, it's throughout not just military literature, but it's throughout popular literature, magazines, it's in cartoons. I'll show some cartoons where it illustrates it. So it really is kind of this major topic of the day, looking forward as the U.S. comes out of World War II. But of course, as all things historical, it has a precedent, right? It doesn't arise from a vacuum. And so that's the spirit of 1920. And this is James W. Wadsworth. He was first a senator and then a congressman from New York, very influential, and he was one of the major boosters or advocates of UMT on Capitol Hill. He actually would be one of the sponsors of the 1940 Selective Service Act, which was called the Burke-Wadsworth Act, named after this gentleman here. And that was the first peacetime draft in American society prior to the U.S. involvement in World War II. So Wadsworth says here, quote, "Despite our very best efforts, we failed utterly in persuading the Senate that the universal military training should be included in the National Defense Act. The opposition to it was overwhelming. We had no chance. The comment most frequently heard in opposition to the provision was, 'But what's the use of imposing such an obligation upon young men in time of peace? There will never be another war.' That was the spirit of 1920, as you may remember. Now, 20 years later, I find myself assuming the effort, this time with a better chance of success," end quote. That's James Wadsworth in 1940. And what he's talking about with the spirit of 1920 is the experience of the Great War, World War I. And in World War I, both before, during, and after World War I, there was this preparedness movement which really sought to advocate for additional preparedness measures. Within that movement, there was a specific movement about military training called the Plattsburgh movement. And it derived its name from one of the main training camps, which was in Plattsburgh, New York. But there were training camps located all around the country. These were voluntary, so these were civilians who would voluntarily come and do military training with the idea that it would prepare the United States better for World War I or the immediate aftermath of World War I. But of course, that was voluntary. It did not take root in the National Defense Act of 1920, which is what Wadsworth was bemoaning just momentarily before. And after World War I, there's rapid demobilization, so the military had gone from very small to very large, and then back to very small quickly. There were severe budget cuts to the military, and one of the questions coming out of World War I was, what would the force structure look like for the U.S. military moving forward? That's the background, that's the spirit of 1920. So back to World War II then, the basis for all plans talks about this strategic rationale. So what is the idea that these advocates are saying for UMT? Well, it's geared around military readiness and mobilization. So if we think about the way in which the United States had faced conflict both in World War I and in World War II, in many ways it was a familiar refrain. That our allies, we'd have strong alliances, and our allies would fight the initial phases of conflict far away. The United States would then take a significant amount of time, typically 2 years, to fully mobilize not only its economy, but its personnel, and then would be able to deploy large numbers of personnel to make a decisive contribution in the war. So that is what had worked well in the past. The idea here is, what if you could speed mobilization? What if you could shrink that 2 years down? How could you do that? Well, one way to do that would be to do a lot of the training beforehand, during peace, before there's conflict. And in doing that, even if these people go to training camps and then go back home, you build up a large general reserve, essentially a reserve of trained people who then, if the U.S. found itself in another major conflict, you could call upon them and mobilize in a much quicker time frame. So that's the idea. It's military in nature. It's trying to create military improvements, and speeding mobilization is the main thing. But as the debate unfolds and as the conversation in American society takes place over a series of years, you'll see that other voices come into the debate, and they start talking about political advantages, societal benefits, and other things that in many ways, many of the architects of the plan didn't really envision. So it starts with this military C is important. All right, so this is George C. Marshall. At the time, he was U.S. Army Chief of Staff. As I mentioned, he was credited with being the architect of U.S. victory. If you notice on his shoulder lapel, there are 5 stars there. That is a very unusual rank. We've only had 5 5-star generals in American history, 4 5-star admirals. All of those people were in World War II. All of those people reported to George Marshall. So he's considered the senior most general really in American history, I think is fair to say. So he really believes in this plan for military reasons, specifically mobilization. And he's a central figure as we go through. All right, target number 1, USA. This is an article in Collier's magazine. It's a popular magazine that many Americans would read at the time for a whole host of reasons, not just military issues, but any number of issues. And this is an article entitled Target Number 1, USA. Quote, if there is a World War III, any nation or alliance which hopes to topple Britain, China, France, Russia, and the United States can be counted on to read the lessons of World War I and World War II. Outstanding among those lessons will be hit the United States first and as hard as possible. Do not give American producing power and war willingness a chance to build up muscle for 2 or 3 years behind a protective screen of other fighting nations, end quote. And that's Collier's magazine in 1945. And what they're talking about is this fear, this insecurity coming out of World War II, that the strategic landscape had changed. If we think about U.S. national security historically, we've been very blessed in terms of we have a large ocean to our east, we have a large ocean to our west, we have friendly neighbors to our north and to our south. That's always benefited us from a national security perspective. But coming out of World War II, there were many changes to that context. One was alliances. So we'd always had strong alliances, but those alliances were now in tatters coming out of World War II. So it wasn't realistic to think that Great Britain or France or any of our allies would perhaps be able to do the same thing moving forward. Also, if you listen to the quote carefully, it described Russia as our ally. That's changing pretty rapidly at this time. So 1945, Russia is our ally. They had fought with us side by side in World War II, but certainly by 1947 and later, that has changed dramatically. So that's another contextual change. And then technology, if we think about World War II and the military technology that was available prior to World War II and then coming out of World War II, long-range strategic bombing was something that didn't exist prior to World War II and now did coming out of World War II. Long-range and amphibious operations were a thing that was capable. And then certainly long-range shipping and logistics. I mean, the militaries had learned during World War II how to do long-range operations in a way that made the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean not look like such a great buffer. So those things had changed, and perhaps the epitome of that change is, of course, the atomic bomb, that in an instance now, an atomic bomb could be dropped anywhere in the world and change the context of the way the U.S. had approached conflict in previous eras. So in an ironic way, then, you would think that coming out of World War II, of all nations, the United States would be the most secure in the way that it looked at the post-war landscape. But I found that's not to be the case, that there's this heightened sense of insecurity coming out of World War II, and a lot of it has to do with this fear of time, that time will no longer be available to do a 2-year mobilization. In fact, I have this wonderful book from 1946 that I was able to get online, and it says, on the cover, it has an atomic bomb going off, and it says, there will be no time. I mean, it really epitomizes this fear in the mid to late 1940s that there will be no time to react to a surprise attack. So for many of these military leaders, then UMT, or Universal Military Training, becomes the answer. I would argue that it also becomes a panacea for them. Not just for them, but also for their political allies that I'll talk about throughout the presentation. So it becomes kind of a cure-all for a lot of things, and in many ways that becomes its own demise. Preaching the gospel. Here we have Walter Weibel. He is a 2-star general. He is George C. Marshall's point person on UMT, and he is tasked with building public support and support on Capitol Hill for this idea. So he's saying here, he's referencing a circular that is basically a directive from Marshall that says the military will make the basis of all their planning UMT moving forward. So that's what he's referencing. But this is Walter Weibel talking about preaching the gospel. Quote, last summer, War Department Circular 347, 1944, outlined the position of the War Department on the question of universal military training. The Secretary of War and the Chief of Staff consider it a project secondary only to winning the war. We have had public relations officers and service command representatives in here orienting them so that they could preach the gospel before the public, end quote. And that's a two-star Army General Walter Weibel, who is leading the charge for the military on this effort. So preaching the gospel then is the marketing effort that the military puts into this campaign. And they really have two audiences. One is Congress. So this is something that will need to be legislated. The military can't make this happen. It has to be legislated. And the draft is coming up for renewal in 1948. So that's what they're planning towards. That's their target. And they're trying to convince people that on Capitol Hill that when that expires, that they would enact universal military training. That's the goal. So Congress, political allies on Capitol Hill, but also the American public. So they're trying to convince the American public that this is a good idea. They're quite successful on both fronts. Public opinion polling of the day showed in a number of polls consistently across time, anywhere from 60 to 75% of Americans polled supported this idea. The challenge became they supported it in many different ways. And so there were all these differences about what it might look like. But generally, there was public support. On Capitol Hill, there's a good bit of support as well, which I'll touch on. So Walter Weibel was involved in this. John J. McCloy was the Undersecretary of War at the time. So he is a civilian who's in charge of the military, and he is also helping push this. They do it through radio, they do it through print ads. They're very aggressive in how they do this. In fact, the Congress would eventually investigate the Army over this because they thought they got too zealous in their advocacy of this plan, and they thought it became propagandizing. So it's an interesting dichotomy between that. They have this huge Bureau of Public Relations which pushes this effort, and there's also this aligned effort with these very prominent civilians. Many of them had served in World War I, and they also want this to come to fruition, and they formed their own Citizens Committee for Military Training of Young Men Incorporated, and they then partner with the military to promote this from a civilian vantage point. So there's a coordination between those two efforts. This is John J. McCloy, Undersecretary of War, so he's leading the effort. You might also know him through his effort. He would be one of the primary folks who would be responsible for helping rebuild Germany after World War II. But before he does that, he's involved in this campaign for universal military training. A pig in a poke. So obviously not everybody supported this idea. There were many different perspectives from many different vantage points. And so the criticism of universal military training I characterize as a pig in a poke. That's what they would call it for a whole host of reasons. And this is Yank magazine. This is from 1945. And here they say, quote, Congress is mulling over legislation on the subject of universal military training. Propaganda agencies representing hundreds of civic, labor, religious, industrial, and veterans organizations are spending heavy money trying to influence people on both sides of the fence. College students debate the issue in classrooms. Barflies have come to blows over it, end quote. That's Yank magazine, 1945. And what it's talking about is the opposition to this idea, the criticism. And it comes from a variety of vantage points for a whole host of reasons. And these are just some examples here that I go into more detail in the book. But pacifist organizations, by and large, are against this plan, primarily because they feel that it will lead to militarism in American society. And so that's a very valid critique. Labor unions also are against this plan, which kind of surprised me as I was doing my research. I started researching a military topic, and by the end I was talking about race relations, labor unions, economy, and so to our students in the room, it's a good methodological tip is to follow the sources wherever they lead you. You'll find it much more interesting than if you stay in kind of a preconceived notion. But labor unions were against this idea primarily because they feared that if all these 18-year-olds went off to military training camps, they might not come back to the labor union. They might not apprentice with the labor union. They might not become members of the labor unions. And it's important to understand, labor unions at this time were incredibly powerful pillars of American society. And so that was a real fear among labor union leaders. Religious groups, obviously there's a whole host of different perspectives in terms of religious groups, but many of the religious groups would argue they feared that sending these young, impressionable 18-year-olds off to military training camps would undermine the values that they had learned in their hometowns and various places. So there was this fear of undermining morals and values from a religious standpoint. Most veterans groups were in support of the plan, but some were against it. Some were against it, and by and large, when they were against it for practical reasons. So they just felt it wouldn't be effective. And they pointed to World War II and to Germany and Italy and said, look, these folks had exactly this type of compulsory military training and service, and they lost the war, and so it's not necessary to be effective. And then education leaders, once again, it kind of surprised me, but when you start thinking about it, it's intuitive. They're recruiting the same population, so they're also, like the labor unions, they are fearful that when these 18-year-olds go off to the training camps, they will not come back to university or colleges. That will hurt enrollment over time. So that's the critique of the plan. And then we get to a matter of broad policy. So this is the Woodrum Committee. This is a congressional committee in the House, 1945, that was specifically set up to study UMT and to make a recommendation one way or the other. And this is the Woodrum Committee. Quote, for these and for other reasons, your committee therefore recommends that the Congress adopt as a matter of broad policy a system of universal military training for the critical years ahead, end quote. And that's the Woodrum Committee, 1945. And so what they're talking about is this recruitment. So it starts with this military idea about mobilization, but in order to make it successful, those military leaders have to garner political allies and political support both in Congress and in the White House. So they first do it in Congress, as you saw with the Woodrum Committee, and then they do it through the White House. So President Roosevelt was supportive of the idea. Of course, he passed away, and President Truman takes over. And President Truman is far more supportive of the idea. He served in World War I. He always talked fondly about his military service and felt like it was something that was very beneficial, certainly to him, and he thought to others as well. But he starts talking, if you pay close attention, he starts talking in different terms. And so he starts talking about national health, combating illiteracy, inculcating citizenship. And that's very different from the way that it's been couched up to this point. And so I argue that this idea then goes through a political metamorphosis, that it starts with a germination of this military idea. In order to move it forward, they have to recruit political allies. As soon as they do that, they're very successful in doing it, but then they sacrifice control over the narrative. And that narrative starts to go through this political metamorphosis where it's talking about other things that are much broader than just military mobilization. So here we have President Truman circa 1945. He becomes one of the most vocal proponents of this idea, although he takes a very different tact on it that I'll explain as we go through this. And he calls on Congress multiple times throughout his presidency to enact UMT. It's one of the major national security proposals that he presents to Congress. The Fort Knox experiment. So here we have Time magazine, 1947, and they're talking about UMT. Quote, Congress, conscious of votes and mothers, would be hard to persuade, but the Army had a test tube experiment in which UMT was apparently working well. From its youngest recruits, it had drawn a battalion, made them UMT guinea pigs at Fort Knox, end quote. That's Time magazine, 1947. And what they're talking about is this UMT experimental unit. So this unit is set up at Fort Knox, Kentucky. It's a battalion-sized unit that's all 18-year-olds. It's never been done before. It's this experimental unit. And the idea is to translate UMT from theory to reality. So it has this dual mandate to experiment and to demonstrate. So to experiment with the ways in which the military would do this. So trying to figure out, how do you go through the training? What would the training look like? How do you make it successful? But more importantly, to demonstrate to the outside world, so that would be to parents, to the American public, to VIPs who they constantly brought to Fort Knox to show off this unit, that this was not only a viable plan, but it was a beneficial plan for American society. So it has this dual mandate. It's led by Brigadier General Johnny Devine. He's a World War II hero. And if you know anything about military rank structure, this battalion should be led by a lieutenant colonel. This is led by a one-star general. He's 2 ranks higher than the norm. That's unusual, but it tells you how serious and how important the Army feels that this unit is, that they would do that. It also has this massive public relations arm to this unit, which is unheard of at a battalion level. So it's not your normal battalion by design. It has its own band. The UMT highlighters go out and do all this public engagement, and in many ways hold these dances and public engagement. And they're countering this concern that I alluded to earlier, that these 18-year-olds would it would undermine their values. And so it's trying to show this best face of this unit, and that this would be something very positive. And the UMT Pioneer is its own own newspaper with a significant news. They bring in journalists who run this battalion newspaper. These are professionals, and all you need to know is that every soldier in the unit gets not 1 copy of the newspaper every week, they get 2. The idea is that they disseminate it, it goes out, they republish a lot of the articles, they do all kind of human interest stories as well. So it's a really fascinating story. This is a picture here. This is Jacob L. Devers. He's a 3-star general on your right, and he's meeting with one of the UMT training cadre. If you see the triangular patch on the helmet, that's actually the unit insignia of the UMT experimental unit. You can still get one of those on eBay. So he's visiting, they bring in all kind of VIPs to visit this unit. Here is Johnny Devine, 1-star general, and you can see the youthful face of they call them UMTs is what they would call them. So UMT and the trainees would be called UMTs, and all kind of newspapers, magazines, they write all these fascinating stories about what's going on at Fort Knox, Kentucky at the experimental unit. All right, so we get to a program for national security. And this is where the political metamorphosis really becomes evident. So this is Harry S. Truman, and he's speaking in 1946 here. Quote, "I want you to be known as the President's Advisory Commission on Universal Training. I want the word military left out. The military phase is incidental to what I have in mind," end quote. Harry S. Truman, 1946. And what he's talking about is he establishes a presidential commission on universal training. Actually this is their report from 1947. Once again, eBay. You can find these things out there. I've read the whole thing. This is an actual copy. And it's high-level civilian leaders that are handpicked to come in and study the issue. So it's chaired by Carl T. Compton. If you're not familiar with him, he was the president of MIT at the time. So very prominent scientist and educational leader. He chaired the committee. The rest of the committee was handpicked to select certain groups in American society. So they picked someone to represent industry, or someone to represent labor, things like that. And they come out with a unanimous recommendation for universal training. They study the issue for just under a year, and then they publish this report, and it goes out to thousands and thousands of different organizations, newspapers, magazines, and basically it's the civilian endorsement of the plan. But it also highlights many implications for American society, because as I said, it starts shifting the narrative, the terms of the debate, and what it means. So here you have a program for national security, and here you have the committee. That's President Truman receiving this same report that's Carl Compton handing him the report. To the far left is Edmund Walsh. He was at the time the vice president of Georgetown University. When I went to Georgetown University, The most prominent school of foreign service in perhaps the world is the Walsh School of Foreign Service, named after that gentleman there. Anna Rosenberg, to the right there, was the first senior leader in the Pentagon who was female. So she, all these very prominent folks. Second from the right is Truman K. Gibson, African-American civil rights leader. He is an advisor to the Secretary of War on civil rights issues. And he's a proponent of UMT. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Here's a cartoon. This is President Truman handing the report to Congress, and he says, "Take it or leave it at our peril." And so this is once again, he's demanding, in many of these speeches and State of the Union addresses, he's asking for Congress to deliver this, as is depicted here in this cartoon. The normal way of life. So this is the 1940s. The U.S. military is segregated at this time, and the military wants to get these training camps established. They need to do so in a year. I mentioned it's a year-long training. So it can't be longer than a year. It needs to be a year or less. And so the military, in solving practical problems, thinks, well, we can't have any weather delays, so we need to make sure that there's good weather wherever we put these training camps. And so they decide to put all the training camps in the South. And so that's an issue in terms of not only the military is segregated at this time, but certainly American society. And so there are civil rights leaders who speak up and start voicing significant concern about what that would mean for race relations in 1940s America. And so you have this Committee Against Jim Crow, Military Service and Training is this civil rights organization that's fighting against this idea, primarily from the vantage point of what it would mean for race relations. A. Philip Randolph, one of the great civil rights leaders of the day, is vociferously against this and actually threatens to lead a boycott of African Americans against not only UMT if it's implemented, but selective service as well. It garners a great deal of publicity, and it's interesting because it's not coincidental that at this very time, this is the spring and summer of 1948, at this very time, July 26, 1948, President Truman signs Executive Order 9981, which publicizes his intent to desegregate the military. It would take years to accomplish. There was great resistance, certainly from the military and segments of American society, and it wouldn't become accomplished until the latter phases of the Korean War. But this is informing that conversation and debate. And then we saw Truman K. Gibson. He is so A. Philip Randolph's an outsider. He's a labor union leader, civil rights leader. Truman K. Gibson's on the inside. He's in with military leaders. He actually thinks it will be a good thing for African Americans for this plan to play out. So there's different voices that are debating each other about this issue. And that is Truman K. Gibson sitting there, African American civil rights leader within the War Department at the time. All right, so just to start wrapping up, a shock throughout the civilized world. This is Archibald Thatcher. He is one of those senior civilian, very wealthy, very prominent civilian leaders. Many of them are lawyers, business leaders who had served in World War I. So that's where they kind of get this idea that this will be useful. And he says here, quote, "On the whole, I think that the old team, although its uniforms may be a little shop-worn, is approaching the goal line and will score a touchdown," end quote. That's Archibald Thatcher. Incidentally, writing to James Wadsworth, who we saw earlier in the presentation. They are colleagues. They both are supportive of this idea and trying to work together to implement UMT. This is in 1947. So this shock throughout the civilized world then is right at the moment in which there's rising optimism for UMT, that finally, as Archibald Thatcher says, we're getting close to achieving our goals. This is 1947, going into 1948. But then in the spring of 1948, everything changes. So context matters, and context changes quickly. Chance matters as well. So there's a series of international crises in 1948, specifically in the spring of 1948. And keep in mind, the draft, the World War II draft, it ends in the summer of 1948. So whatever they're going to do, they're on a timetable. It has to be done in the summer of 1948. one way or the other. But unrelated to that, in the spring of 1948, you have a series of crises. So in February, there's a communist coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia. It really rattles a lot of U.S. Policymakers and thinkers about what the future of Europe will be. In March, you have kind of this public commitment to the Marshall Plan. We've heard that. That's George Marshall, who started that certainly in 47. But by the spring of 48, the U.S. is committing to do this. It actually gets approved on April 3rd, 1948. The Brussels Treaty in March, so this is creating the Western European Union, which eventually fold into NATO, so kind of this alliance approach. Israel is recognized as a state in May, and then in June, the Berlin blockade. So all that's happening is creating this crises environment where there's really a concern that the U.S. might be heading towards another major conflict at this time. It's right at the time where this comes to a decision point. And of course, politics always plays a role, and so it's important to understand the domestic political context. The 1946 midterm election was a wave election for the Republican Party. The Republican Party decimated the Democratic Party in the 1946 midterms and ushered in a whole new Republican leadership that was staunchly opposed to President Truman's policies, not just on UMT, but on a whole host of issues. And so all of a sudden there was a lot more resistance within Congress. And at that time, then selective service, this idea that you would pick and choose who would serve, it would be compulsory, it wouldn't be universal like the other plan, that starts to get elevated because you can implement it quickly. As soon as you implement selective service, the next month you can have people in uniform. If you implement universal military training, even though they think it's a better plan, it's going to be at least a year, probably a year and a half, until you can have people produced in that general reserve. So that's that paradox I talked about earlier. So here is another cartoon. This is President Truman. There's 3 bats aligned on the wall. These are his major planks for how he envisions national security moving forward. He tells Congress we must be ready to back up what we say. And the bats are, in order, the ERP, or European Recovery Plan, otherwise known as the Marshall Plan. So that's economic in nature and based on alliances as well. Then you have 2 military in nature. One is universal training, which he sees not so much militarily, but for these other reasons, and then selective service. Now Truman argues these things are not mutually exclusive. He sees selective service as a short-term bridge to universal training. So he views them aligned, that you would implement selective service in the crisis environment. You would allow that to get you through the crisis while you implemented universal training, and then you would phase out selective service and just go to universal training. That's Truman's idea. That's not what happens, but that's how he views it. That's why they're both represented there. All right, so just to wrap up, the paradox of preparedness. So my argument is that the defeat of UMT is the birth of the Cold War draft. We get, in 1948, you have this critical moment where, because of the crisis environment, selective service gets elevated in a way that declines the appeal of universal military training. You have this, what I would call this echo campaign from 1948 to 1951, where the same thing happens again. So they start pushing for universal military training again after 1948. They start making gains. It looks like they're going to make progress. And what happens in 1950, the summer 1950, all of a sudden a surprise attack from North Korea to South Korea, and all of a sudden the U.S. is in another crisis environment, and the same thing happens where they decide to renew selective service. Ironically, they name it Universal Military Training and Service Law. So that's the law. That's the law that implements selective service and dooms UMT, but they actually they name it Universal Military Training and Service Law. The idea being that, yeah, we'll do this, and then down the road we'll implement this other thing. It never happens. One of the things that's interesting to fast forward, so when it first starts, selective service, it's fairly universal in application just because of the age group and cohort. But then slowly over time, exemptions and deferments continue to multiply and grow, and by the mid-1960s, it becomes wholly and patently unfair in the way that it's executed. And that's exactly what these people would have said in 1940, is that's why the universal aspect of UMT was appealing, because, at least in their articulation of it, it was fair. And they actually foresaw, they were very prescient in the sense they saw that once you start picking and choosing and you don't have a sound basis for how you do that, you're opening yourself up for a lot of criticism, which we saw certainly in the 1960s. It really comes to a head in 65 as the U.S. ramps up for the Vietnam War. So this paradox of preparedness then, this dichotomy between selective service on the one hand, UMT on the other. Many military planners saw UMT as the better, long-term, fairer solution, but selective service was a short-term solution, can be implemented quickly. And so this idea of peacetime planning, so when it's peacetime, you can think about the best long-term solution. So that's what happened. During peacetime, they would talk about UMT, they'd talk about its benefits, but in peacetime, you don't have a sense of urgency. So they'd kind of talk and they'd debate and nothing would really happen. As soon as you switched over to a wartime urgency, the dynamic shifted. That's this paradox where then you have to choose something that you can implement quickly. And so it doesn't matter that they think UMT is the better plan, they've got to go with the one that they can implement quicker, hence the paradox of preparedness as I argue in the book. So thank you so much. I really have appreciated being here with you today. I certainly am open to any discussion, questions that you have, and this gives you a general overview, and there's certainly far more to the story than I can fit into 45 minutes. Thank you so much for your time today.